This really happened to me, and sitting here years later, I can still smell the lemon oil we used to polish my mother's dining table. I'm not proud of how angry I became, only that I lived long enough to turn that anger into something useful. They gathered us in the old house on Trad Street. Siblings, a few cousins, and the family friend who always appeared when there was gossip to harvest, because James said there were final papers we all needed to see. Under the chandelier, with 2 bulbs burned out, he slid a manila envelope across the oak and announced that I had voluntarily waived my inheritance. I watched my own forged signature glint in the lamplight, while the silver bowl in the center of the table, my mother's wedding gift, reflected everyone's faces back at us, like a funhouse mirror. And while Linda tapped her polished nail against a crystal water glass, I realized they were stealing my mother's voice, the same way they'd stolen my name. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is. Right now, it's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. I can tell you the exact color of the paper. Not white, not ivory, but that cheap copier stock that promises authority without earning it. The notary stamp was smudged like a thumbprint someone tried to wipe away. Even before my breath settled, my head started cataloging details the way it used to when I did renovations measure twice. Cut. Once, no room for guesses. The date listed put my supposed waiver 2 weeks after Mom's stroke, which made no human sense because those 2 weeks had spent at MUSC Health, taking the night shift, listening to monitors blink and the nurses whisper through their rounds. I could name every cafeteria special in that stretch. Monday shrimp and grits, Tuesday pot, roast the way men name their years in battles. James kept his tone benevolent, which is a tone men use when they believe the law is on their side. And decency is just a story. You remember John, he said, gesturing toward the neat rows of paragraphs like a tour guide. You told us very clearly you weren't interested in handling the maintenance on the house or the land that you'd prefer. We take it off your hands. We were all there. I was there for plenty birthdays. With sagging grocery store cake, hurricanes that rattled the shutters. The winter mom slipped on the steps, and I hauled her to the ER while he was in Kiowa golfing. But I was not there for that. No, I said, my voice small at first, then impossible to ignore. No, I did not say that. Maybe you don't remember. Linda drew the words out like taffy sweet, on the surface, sticky underneath. A new pearl sat in the hollow of her throat, glowing like something she'd earned. I looked to the silver bowl again. My warped reflection looked back like a stranger mouth. Thin eyes older than I felt. I thought of Mom's. Real will read out loud 2 years before she died, while she drank sweet tea and argued with me about the Braves' bullpen equal shares. She said, because fairness is the only way family survives. You could hear the clink of ice in her glass. When she said it, she made me repeat the phrase to her twice as if she knew we'd need to return to it, like a prayer. Look, the family friend said her name was Judith, and she wasn't blood, but wanted to ban anybody's accusing anyone. This is administrative. These are just decisions. That's what people call it when they dress theft in office clothes. I picked up the papers anyway, because I'm the sort of man who wants to believe he's mistaken before he believes he's been betrayed. My hand shook so hard the sheet rattled like a flag on a bad day. The signature looked like mine in the way a mask looks like a face. The curve of the J, the confident slash through the T. The low, steady, final rain, close enough to fool a stranger, maybe even a tired judge. Not close enough to fool the man who'd been signing John Dalton on foreman time cards and tax returns since 1978. You had this notarized, I said. Where, by whom? The stamp said Donovan K.R., the rest lost in the smudge, the address. A West Ashley P.O. box that set my teeth on edge. Why does that matter? James asked, all innocence. You signed it. I felt the first true wave of heat, then rage. Yes, but also something colder that slid under my skin and made a home there resolve. There are moments in a man's life when the ceiling of what he can endure drops down to kiss him on the forehead. All I heard in that room were the cicadas through the open window, the muffled hum of a tourist carriage on the street, and Mom's voice, fairness. Or nothing, I didn't sign this, I said, but I'll sign something today. I reached for the pen in my pocket and wrote. Neat as a ledger. I contest this document in full. Then I slid the papers back across the table, where the silver bowl caught the edge and flashed a hard line of light onto James's cufflink. He laughed, one burst of air that smelled like confidence and cheap mint. You think you want to fight, old man? I know I do. I left before anyone could play at hugging me. On the front steps, I paused and put my palm against the flaking paint of the railing. The same rail I had sanded and repainted with Mom one spring, when her hands were still sure. The heat had baked the wood down into something warm and familiar. The street's live oaks threw lacework shadows across the worn bricks. I thought stupidly about the first time I brought my late wife Annie to this house, and how she'd laughed at the way the back door stuck in summer. That door would stick forever, whether or not the will stuck too. Some things you learn to live with. Others you break free. I walked the length of trad to meeting where the smells of fried shrimp and exhaust braided together in the kind of rope only a coastal city can spin. By the time I turned onto Wentworth toward the small house I rented, the anger had cooled into something you could lay a foundation on. It spent a career making rotten, beam-solid, truing walls back to plumb. Fraud, I realized, is just a crooked frame dressed in drywall. It looks fine until the storm hits. I intended to be the storm. Sleep was a rumor that night. I brewed coffee in the old percolator. Annie refused to throw out and spread every paper I owned across my kitchen table. Old checks, tax returns, a mortgage satisfaction letter from when I finally paid off our little place in North Charleston before we sold it the lease on my meeting street handyman shop with my signature in the thick ballpoint, always the same weight at the downstroke, a little stutter on the up. The kitchen clock ticked over each hour like a metronome practicing grief. At dawn, a gull screamed from somewhere it didn't belong, and I dialed the one number I trusted for trouble. Carl had been a detective in Charleston back when men kept their secrets in file folders instead of the cloud. Now he did security at the courthouse and played chess with his grandson on weekends down by the Battery. You sound like you ate tax for breakfast, he said when he picked up voice, still soft with sleep. I need to know how to tear a forgery down to studs. I told him he whistled once low. Bring what they gave you. Bring your pens and bring a story that doesn't wobble. We met at a diner on East Bay that still served waitresses strong enough to discourage nonsense. The counter was cool under my forearms. The coffee hot enough to remind you you're alive. Carl spread the papers out under the fluorescent lights and put on a pair of readers he pretended he didn't own. People think forgery shows up in the flourish, he said, tapping the signature. What gives it away is fatigue. Honest signatures get sloppy in the same places. Dishonest ones tighten where they shouldn't. See your D. He pointed at a spot only an old cop and a man sick with adrenaline would see. Whoever did this tries too hard to be you, I wanted to say. James's name so bad it hurt my teeth. But wishes don't build cases, and I had a case to build. If I fight, I asked, what am I walking into? Carl didn't lie to me. Probate court doesn't like drama. Your siblings will say you're confused, greedy, vengeful, tired. They'll bleed you with motions and make every day a hill. You want to win. He looked me dead in the eye. You make it simple, you keep receipts, and you don't get rattled when they turn family into a weapon. There, in the hiss of the coffee machine and the clink of plates, he gave me a name. Elizabeth Grant, an attorney who'd made a living untangling lies, with patience and civility that cut like wire. Her office sat in an old house on Broad Street, where the walls remembered other men's secrets. Elizabeth had the kind of handshake that said she'd earned her confidence one loss at a time. She let me talk until I ran out of sentences, then asked for the one thing I hadn't brought proof of who I was. When I wasn't being wronged, bring me your life, she said. Not the big things, the small ones, water bills, checks, leases, the postcard. Your wife signed in the hospital gift shop. Well, show the court that your hand knows itself. I went to the storage unit after lunch. Air hitched with the scent of rubber and dust that corrugated. Docker rattled up like a cheap drum roll. I lifted out boxes with handwriting that belonged to younger versions of me, and Annie moving inventories, Christmas ornaments, a staple packet labeled Taxes 2001 in a neatness I don't remember earning. I found the page with the receipt for our first anniversary dinner at Fig Annie laughing, her hair smelling like drugstore shampoo, because we were too broke for anything fancy. I found a check from the time I paid the flooring subcontractor in cash and wrote the note. Never again next to the amount. Each paper told a little story. I existed stubbornly in ink. When I brought the boxes to Elizabeth, she didn't say anything at first. She just started stacking, categorizing, laying the architecture of a life out on her desk. Well, get a forensic document examiner, she said, sliding a sticky note onto the forged will. Well, subpoena the notary. Well, pull filing dates. Well, make them explain things that don't want to be explained. What if they come for me? I asked. It felt naive and honest, and 62 all at once. They already did, she said. That's why you're here. Then softer. Don't answer your phone after 10. Don't confront anyone outside the courthouse. And don't underestimate people who feel an inheritance slipping away. Money can make blood mean less. I walked home with the ocean breathing somewhere beyond the houses, and every brick under my feet reminding me this city survives. By balancing beauty and rot. Muscadine vines curled over a gate. A tourist squinted at a map somewhere. A boy practiced drums he would get right. One day I felt bigger than my fear and smaller than the war ahead. The call came that night. No voice, just a breath on the line and the click of someone deciding they'd said enough. I wrote down the time and sat very still. A car passed, then another, crossed the street. Mrs. Alvarez in the blue bungalow turned on her kitchen light, and the smell of onions drifted out through her screen door. The ordinary managed to keep me from coming apart. I put the forged will on the kitchen table, placed Mom's frame photo beside it, there in the sundress she liked because it made her feel like a ship with a good wind, and stared long enough for the paper to stop being a weapon and become a puzzle. If James thought it'd accept a lie to keep family peace, he forgot who raised me. Mom taught us to tell the truth, even when it cost us dessert. The will would cost them more than that. A text from an unknown number arrived just after midnight. Walk away, old man. Family stays out of court. It wasn't signed, but cruelty doesn't need a signature. I screenshotted it, sent it to Elizabeth and Carl, and turned my phone face down. Then I grabbed a pen and started a list on a legal pad. To do under it. 3 columns, people, paper, places. Under people, I wrote notary witnesses, hospital staff. Under paper bank, records, filing receipts, Mom's original will. Under places, probate court, West Ashley, P.O. Box. The cafe where Judith gossips. You can hear truth if you listen long enough in the right room. By dawn, my hands had stopped shaking. At 62, resolve feels different than it does at 32. It's heavier and it's harder to lift. But once you shoulder it, you can walk a long way. The sun came up over Charleston, all soft and smug, the way it does when it knows people will spend good money to take pictures of it. I brewed fresh coffee, put on the shirt. Annie always said, made me look honest, pale blue sleeves rolled, and practiced saying the sentence Elizabeth had told me to own. That is not my signature. Then I went to the courthouse to file my contest. The building smelled like old wood and older arguments. At the counter, a clerk with a lanyard that said, Carol stamped my papers with the unceremonious thud of bureaucracy and slid a copy back to me. You sure? She asked, not unkindly. I've never been more sure, I said, and meant it. Outside, the air felt like a clean sheet snapping on a clothesline. I pulled my phone from my pocket to call Carl with the update thumb hovering over his name when a shadow fell across the sidewalk, and I looked up to see James leaning against a lamppost in his lawyer suit, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and a folded photograph in his hand that I recognized before I even took a step, because some lines once crossed can never be uncrossed. The photograph James held that morning was folded crisp, like he'd ironed the creases himself, preparing for the theater of intimidation. He didn't open it, just tapped the corner against his palm and grinned. You've really done it now, he said, voice low, a half-laugh riding beneath the words. You'd think a judge is going to listen to an old man with a stack of junk mail and nostalgia. I clenched my jaw so tight it hurt. It's not nostalgia when it's truth. He smirked wider, unfolding the paper just enough for me to glimpse it. Another candid shot of me this time, leaving Elizabeth's office on Broad Street. Whoever took it had been close enough to catch the slight hitch in my walk, the slump in my shoulders. He held it out like a badge of power, then snapped it back before I could touch it. Keep playing lawyer, he said. You'll regret it. I didn't answer. I learned long ago in construction sites and union negotiations that some men feed on your reaction. You don't give them the meal. Instead, I walked straight past him, phone already out, snapping a picture of him with the folded photograph in hand. His smirk faltered at that. Evidence cuts both ways. Back at Elizabeth's office, I slid my phone across her desk. She studied the photo, her lips pursing. Good. You did the right thing. Well, enter it if we need to. But what if she held up a hand. John, listen to me. Their arrogance is the weapon, but it's also the weakness. Every time James thinks he's reminding you who's in charge, he's handing me material. I leaned back in the chair, letting her words settle. The fight wasn't just about proving the forgery. It was about proving the pattern, intimidation, manipulation, fraud. A whole lattice of deceit. Carl joined us that evening, dropping a thick folder on Elizabeth's desk with a grunt, pulled. Every record on that notary guy's name is Donovan Keller. Hayes been suspended before shady real estate filings complaints from clients. Nothing that stuck, but it paints a picture. Elizabeth flipped through eyes sharp. This is gold. Well, subpoena him, force him to explain his history. Carl leaned back in his chair. Also found something else. They witnesses on that were both of them made sudden deposits in their bank accounts within days of notarizing it. Not big enough to scream bribery, but enough to raise eyebrows. I rubbed a hand over my face, so they paid people off. My own family. Carl's eyes softened. People will do worse for less. Elizabeth tapped her pen against the folder. This, it is what I meant. John, they built their fraud on arrogance. They thought no one would look this deep, but were looking. The weeks rolled forward like a slow hurricane. Depositions, filings, motions. It was an endless march, but each step carved another crack in the wall. They'd built. The first time Linda had to testify. Under oath, she wore a pale suit that made her look ghostly under the fluorescent lights. Her voice trembled when she swore she'd been present when I signed the waiver. Elizabeth's cross-examination sliced gently questions that seemed harmless until the contradictions stacked up. Where exactly did you see him sign? At the dining room table. What day? Friday. Elizabeth glanced at the judge. That Friday, Mr. Dalton was at MUSC with his mother according to hospital records. Visiting hours log him in at 7:12 p.m. Can you explain how he was both at the hospital and signing documents at the same time? Linda's face flushed red, her pearl necklace trembling against her throat. She stammered, faltered, then fell silent. The room hummed with the sound of her lie collapsing. That night, though, I paid for the small victory. When I returned home, the door to my handyman shop was ajar. Inside, the place was ransacked, drawers, dumb tools scattered. Nothing expensive was missing, but one thing was gone. A shoebox of old personal papers I'd kept under the counter. On the counter, in its place, sat another note. Stop digging. My hands shook as I called Carl. He arrived within 20 minutes, flashlight sweeping the room. They're trying to break you, John, but this is sloppy. Breaking and entering. They're escalating. Judges don't like escalation. Elizabeth agreed when I showed her good well at it. Every act of intimidation becomes another nail in their coffin. But lying awake that night, I felt the weight of it. This wasn't just legal anymore. It was dangerous. My own blood was willing to stalk me, break into my business, steal pieces of my life for what? Money control. I stared at Annia's photograph on my nightstand, her smile frozen in a time before all this madness. What would you tell me? I whispered. I imagined her voice steady. No nonsense. You fight, smart. You don't let them write you out of your own mother's story. The next morning I doubled down. I catalogued every missing document from the shoebox, recreated copies where I could file police reports, logged everything with Elizabeth. I started locking the shop like it was Fort Knox cameras, installed, lights set on timers. And still the trial moved closer. James swaggered into court each day, his lawyer, Randall, strutting beside him. They laughed too loud in the hallway, tried to shake hands with reporters, acted like kings of the courthouse. But I could see it now, the cracks in their armor. Linda avoided my eyes. One cousin skipped a hearing entirely terrified of perjuring herself again, and James, she had grown sharper, meaner, more desperate. Elizabeth noticed too. They're losing control, she told me after one long day of motions. That's when people make mistakes. I nodded. I was counting on it, because the deeper we dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about a forged signature. It was about exposing an entire network of lies, every ugly root. And I wasn't stopping until the whole tree came down. Even if it meant burning what little family I had left, the first time I took the stand. My heart felt like it was hammering nails into my ribs. The bailiff swore me in and I placed my hand on the Bible, its leather cover cool against my palm. For a second I thought about Mom, how she used to make us swear to tell the truth before we tattled on each other as kids. God already knows, she'd say. With that sideways smile, Randall, their attorney, wasted no time trying to tear me down. He prowled the courtroom like a showman, flashing his polished shoes at the jury box. And his smirk at me, Mr. Dalton, he began. Isn't it true you were under stress during your mother's illness, that you might have forgotten certain details? I gripped the armrest, breathed slow, and answered the way Elizabeth had drilled into me. Calm, simple, factual. No, sir, I remember everything. I was with her nearly every night at the hospital. He leaned in closer, as if proximity gave him power. So you claim, but documents, legally filed documents, show your signature. Are you accusing your own family of fraud? The room hushed. Even the air seemed to lean in. Yes, I said clearly, the word echoing louder than I expected. That signature is not mine, and my family forged it. Gasps rippled through the gallery. James shifted uncomfortably, his jaw clenching. Linda's hand flew to her pearls again. Randall tried to paint me as a bitter old man chasing money, showing the court photos of my modest handyman shop my rented home on Wentworth isn't. It true. You have financial struggles, Mr. Dalton. He pressed, Elizabeth objected, but the judge allowed it. So I answered, yes. Like anyone who works with his hands for 40 years, I've had tight months. But I never stole from my family. Can they say the same? Murmurs spread. Randall's smirk faltered. The days blurred into a grind of testimony, motions and exhaustion. I'd leave the courthouse with my head pounding the weight of it all, pressing into my shoulders. Carl would sometimes walk with me to the Battery afterward, where the breeze from the harbor cooled the fire inside me. They're cracking. John, he'd say, you can hear it in their voices. But at night, the threats kept coming. I'd hear footsteps outside my window, see shadows that didn't belong. Once I found a dead fish on my porch with a note pinned to its fin. Family feeds itself, I brought it to Elizabeth the next morning. The stink filling her office. She didn't flinch. Good, she said. More evidence of intimidation. Every stunt they pull adds weight to our case, but inside I was shaken. At 62, you want to believe you've lived through the worst of people, that cruelty belongs to younger men. But my own blood was showing me there's no age limit on greed. Then came the notary. Donovan Keller, subpoenaed and sour. He shuffled into court, with sweat dampening his collar. His voice trembled as Elizabeth questioned him. Mr. Keller, do you recognize this will? Yes, he muttered. Did you witness John Dalton sign it? A pause too long. He signed off. Yes, Elizabeth's tone sharpened. But did you witness him sign it? Keller licked his lips, glanced at James, then back at the judge. No, I did not. The words dropped like a bomb. Our gallery erupted in whispers. Judge Franklin banged her gavel for silence, but the damage was done. My sibling's fraud had a crack running straight through it. Randall tried to recover, painting Keller as unreliable, but the man was already unraveling. Under Elizabeth's steady hand, he admitted he'd been compensated for notarizing documents he had seen signed. I stared at James. Then his face was pale, his eyes blazing with rage he couldn't hide. For the first time, he looked less like a man in control and more like a cornered animal. That night, after Keller's testimony, I drove home feeling something close to hope. But when I pulled into my driveway, the headlights swept across words spray-painted on my garage door. Liar. I sat there in the car engine, idling the word glaring back at me in red paint. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, not from fear this time, but from fury. Carl arrived minutes later. He stood in front of the word, shaking his head. They're done, John. This is desperation. You don't go to vandalism when you're winning. He snapped photos, logged the time, called the police, but I barely heard him. I was staring at that word, and something inside me hardened. They thought they could define me with paint, erase me with paper, silence me with threats. But all they'd done was carve my resolve deeper. The next day in court, Elizabeth laid it all out. The forgery, the bribed witnesses, the notary's confession, the intimidation. She built the story brick by brick, each piece fitting into place until even the judge leaned forward intent. When James took the stand again, his arrogance had soured into anger. He snapped at Elizabeth's questions, contradicted himself, lashed out at me. "You never deserved any of it," he shouted at one point before the judge silenced him. And in that moment I saw it, the man he'd grown up with, reduced to a child, throwing a tantrum in front of a city that no longer believed him. Elizabeth leaned close to me as the court recessed. "We've got them," she whispered. "One more push, and they're finished." I nodded. But deep inside, I knew something. This wasn't just about finishing them in court. This was about making sure the whole city saw who they really were. Because revenge isn't quiet. Revenge echoes. And I was about to make sure theirs did. When the threats turned physical, I knew the game had shifted. It started with a brick. I heard the crash at 2 a.m. The sharp shatter of glass exploding into my living room. I shot out of bed, heart slamming, and found the brick lying on my carpet wrapped in duct tape. A note was stuck to it. "Last chance John family doesn't belong in court." I called Carl before I even swept the glass. He arrived with his flashlight and his pistol eyes scanning the street like it was a war zone. He picked up the brick with a gloved hand, muttered a curse under his breath. "They're cornered. That's why they're stupid now. This is good for us. John, ugly, but good." I stared at the mess on my floor, the night air blowing through the broken window. "They're my family," I said softly, almost to myself. "And they want me gone." Carl set the brick down gently, like it was evidence, which it was. "Blood's just plumbing, brother. You don't get to choose how it flows. What matters is what you build with it." And they built this. The next day in court, Elizabeth wasted no time presenting the photos of the vandalism. The brick, the police report, Judge Franklin's. Frown deepened with each piece of evidence. "Mr. Dalton," she said, turning to James, "can you explain why these incidents seem to follow every step of this case?" James straightened his suit, but his voice cracked at the edges. "I have no idea what he's talking about. Maybe he's staging this for sympathy." Elizabeth's eyes glinted. "So your theory, Mr. Dalton, is that my client is smashing his own windows, vandalizing his own property, and intimidating himself with anonymous notes, all while providing photographic and police evidence to this court." The gallery chuckled, the sound low but deadly. James's face flushed crimson. But it wasn't over. Randall was too slick to let the case slip without a fight. He filed for delays, claimed we were fabricating, tried to have evidence thrown out each day, dragged into the next exhaustion, settling in my bones like damp. One afternoon, Elizabeth called me into her office. She shut the blinds, leaned across her desk. "John, listen carefully. They're pushing for a private settlement. They'll offer you cash enough to tempt you if you drop the case. They know they're losing." I shook my head before she'd even finished. "I don't want their money. I want the truth." Her lips curved into a rare smile. "Good. Because the truth is about to come out." Carl delivered the knockout blow. He'd been combing through James's financials with a retired IRS buddy. What he found was the final nail, a series of payments to the notary, to the so-called witnesses, even to Randall, disguised as consulting fees. It wasn't just fraud, it was conspiracy. Elizabeth presented the records in court with surgical precision. One by one, she laid out the timeline. My mother's stroke the rush to fabricate her waiver. The payments funnel out afterward. She pointed to the numbers, the dates, the connections. Your Honor, she said, her voice firm but calm. This is not a family dispute. This is organized fraud, intimidation, and perjury. My client has been humiliated, threatened, and attacked for standing up for the truth. But the truth, as always, has a way of surfacing. Silence blanketed the courtroom. Even the air conditioning hummed quieter. Judge Franklin removed her glasses, rubbing her temples. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that stilled the room. I have heard enough. This court will reconvene tomorrow for my ruling. That night I sat on my porch with Carl, the summer heat pressing against us like a heavy hand. The cicadas buzzed, the streetlights glowed, and somewhere a dog barked in the distance. You nervous? Carl asked, sipping from a thermos. Terrified, I admitted, but also ready. Ready to end this? He nodded slowly. They tried to break you, John. But you didn't bend. That counts for something. I thought of Mum again, her words echoing in my head. Fairness is the only way family survives. I whispered them into the humid night, as if she could hear me. The next morning the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the benches, notebooks ready. The gallery buzzed with whispers until the bailiff barked for silence. Judge Franklin's voice cut through the air. This court finds the will in question invalid. The estate will be divided equally among the heirs, according to Margaret Dalton's original wishes. Furthermore, due to evidence of fraud, forgery, and intimidation, this case will be referred to the district attorney for criminal investigation. Fourth gavel came down with a sharp crack. I exhaled so hard it felt like I'd been holding my breath for months. Elizabeth placed a steady hand on my arm. Her eyes shining with quiet triumph, Carl clapped me on the back, grinning like a man who'd seen a war won. Across the aisle, James's face was a storm rage. Disbelief, fear. Linda stared at the floor, pearls trembling. The cousins shifted uncomfortably, their loyalty evaporating in the heat of exposure. It was over, but it was also just beginning. As I walked out of the courthouse, the reporters swarmed cameras, flashing. Mr. Dalton, how does it feel to win? One shouted. I stopped, met their gaze, and said, the only thing that mattered. It feels like justice for my mother. For the truth and for every person who's ever been told to stay quiet when they knew better. The microphone shoved closer, but I didn't say more. Some victories speak for themselves. That night, I sat again on my porch with a glass of bourbon. The photo James had once flashed at math, one meant to intimidate, now sat framed on my table inside, not as a threat, but as a trophy. Proof that I hadn't just survived their fraud, I'd destroyed it. But as the cicadas sang and the bourbon warmed my chest, I realized something chilling winning didn't erase the wound. Family had turned predator, and though the court had restored fairness, the scars would linger. I whispered into the night voice, low, certain, you'll never erase me again. And in that moment I knew my revenge was complete. Not because I'd beaten them in court, but because I'd taken back the one thing they could never forge, my dignity. When the gavel fell and Judge Franklin's ruling echoed through that room, you could almost hear the air leave my siblings' lungs. But the story didn't end with the verdict. It rarely does. Courtrooms end with words. Real life keeps breathing afterward, messy and loud. The days that followed were like living under a spotlight. Charleston's Post and Courier ran a headline, Local Family at War Over Estate Fraud. My phone rang, non-stop, neighbors, old friends, even folks I hadn't spoken to in years. Some called to congratulate me, others to whisper that they always knew James was up to something. But not all the attention was kind. Anonymous letters came in the mail, scrawled with childish threats. Snitch rat Judas. I pinned them to a corkboard in my kitchen, not as trophies but as reminders. Every attempt to break me had become another brick in the wall of proof. Elizabeth called me into her office the week after the ruling. Her smile was thinner now, more cautious. "We won the estate, John," she said, "but you need to prepare yourself. The DA's office is moving forward. Your siblings might be indicted. This isn't just civil anymore. It's criminal." I nodded, though my stomach twisted. I wanted the truth. If the truth means handcuffs, then that's where it leads. She leaned forward. Be ready for more pushback. People who face prison time don't go quietly. She was right. One night I was locking up my handyman shop when I saw a shadow break, away from the alley. The figure moved fast, but not fast enough. I caught the glint of Linda's pearl necklace. In the dim light, she stopped short when she realized I recognized her. "John," she hissed voice, ragged. "Why are you doing this? Why couldn't you just let it go?" Her words cut, not because they hurt, but because of how small they sounded. This was the same sister who had clicked her nails against a water glass while watching me read a forged signature, smug and certain. Now she looked like a child caught with a hand in the jar because Mom didn't raise me to let lies win. I said evenly. Her eyes darted away, her shoulders hunched. She whispered so low I almost didn't hear it. "James made me. He said if I didn't go along, I'd be out too." Then she turned and disappeared into the night. Before I could say anything else, I stood there in the quiet street, the lamplight buzzing overhead, and realized something crucial. Fear had hollowed them out. They weren't villains in their own minds. They were survivors of their own greed. But that didn't make them innocent. Carl met me for coffee the next morning. I told him what Linda had said. He stirred his cup slowly, eyes thoughtful. "That's good," he said. "Fear makes people talk. The DA will squeeze her, and shall give James up. It always unravels from the inside." I stared into my mug, steam rising. "It's strange, Carl. I wanted revenge, but now that it's happening, I don't feel the way I thought I would." He chuckled. "That's because revenge isn't fire, John. It's water. It doesn't explode. It erodes. Takes time. But when it's done, the rock is gone." I let his words settle. The indictments came in late summer. James was charged with fraud and conspiracy. Linda got a lighter charge for perjury. And the cousins were hit with aiding and abetting. It made the evening news, their mugshots flashing between commercials for car dealerships and fried chicken. I sat alone in my living room, the TV light flickering against the broken window. I still hadn't replaced. My siblings' faces looked back at me, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt a hollow grief we'd started as kids, running barefoot down Charleston's cobbled streets, and now we were a headline. But grief didn't erase the truth. They'd tried to erase me first. The fallout spread fast. Neighbors whispered. Cousins who hadn't been charged distanced themselves, claiming ignorance. James's business contacts pulled away. Contracts were cancelled. His name soured. Linda stopped showing up at church. The family tree we'd all grown on was suddenly bare, its branches blackened. And me, I found something I didn't expect. Respect. Strangers stopped me on King Street, saying things like "good on you," standing up to them. A young man at the hardware store told me his uncle had stolen his inheritance too, but he hadn't had the strength to fight. "You showed me it's possible," he said. It was humbling and heavy. I hadn't set out to inspire anyone. I just wanted fairness. But sometimes standing up lights a torch you didn't mean to carry. One evening weeks after the indictments, I walked through Magnolia Cemetery to visit Mom's grave. The sun was sinking, casting long shadows across the stones. I knelt by her marker, brushed leaves off the carved letters, and set down a small bouquet of camellias. "I did it, Mom," I whispered. "I kept it fair, just like you said." The wind rustled through the moss-draped oaks, and for a moment I felt her there the way she used to sit with me on the porch after long days sipping sweet tea, her voice soft but firm. Fairness is the only way family survives. I stayed until the sky went dark, the cicadas singing their endless song. But the final reminder came not from the court, not from the DA, not from James or Linda. It came in an envelope slipped under my door one night. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 words scrawled in black ink. "We remember you." No threats this time, no intimidation, just acknowledgement. They hadn't erased me. They couldn't. And as I sat there, the note in my hand, I realized the chilling truth. Revenge doesn't end with gavel strikes or headlines. It lingers in the silence afterward, in the way shadows move, in the way your own blood looks at you differently forever. That was the price, and it was worth every penny. The first arraignment hearing for James was a circus. The courthouse steps were crawling with reporters, their cameras flashing like lightning bugs gone mad. James arrived in a suit, as if fabric could hide the stench of guilt, but the cuffs around his wrists made it impossible to pretend I stood across the street with Carl watching. "You going in?" Carl asked. I shook my head. "Not today. This isn't mine anymore. The state's got him now." Still, I couldn't look away when the reporters shouted questions. "Did you forge the will? Did you intimidate your brother?" James kept his head down, his lawyer shielding him. Linda trailed behind, pale, her pearls gone, her hands twisting in front of her. For a fleeting second, she looked across the street at me. Her eyes held no anger, only exhaustion, maybe even regret. And then she looked away. The DA called me in for questioning. 2 weeks later. The office was cold, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Assistant District Attorney Jenkins, a sharp woman in her 40s, asked me to walk through every detail again. Every note, every brick, every spray-painted word, Mr. Dalton, she said at the end, her voice even but firm. "I want you to understand, this won't just end with a guilty verdict. This will stain your siblings' names for the rest of their lives. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about it long and hard. Then I nodded. They were prepared to erase me from existence. I'm prepared for the truth to erase them. She studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod. Fair enough. Meanwhile, Charleston buzzed. The Daltons had always been a known family, named small business owners, old Charleston stock. Now that name was whispered in grocery store aisles, dissected in barber shops, and muttered about at Sunday services. Strangers looked at me differently, some with sympathy, others with curiosity, a few with thinly veiled envy. But in the quiet moments, I felt the loneliness creep in. Family isn't something you replace at 62. It cut cancer from the tree, but the branches left behind were still bare. Some nights I caught myself almost dialing Linda's number before remembering there was nothing left to say. I filled the silence with work, my handyman shop. Though, scarred from the break-in, became my anchor. I fixed cabinets, repaired shutters, sanded decks for neighbors. Every nail I drove into wood felt like proof. I still belonged here, that I hadn't been erased. The criminal trial began in the fall. This time I sat in the courtroom. Though I wasn't a plaintiff anymore, I was a witness. The DA laid out the case with brutal clarity. The forged signature, the bribe notary, the payments, the intimidation evidence I'd once carried in my trembling hands, now spoke with its own voice. James sat at the defense table, his face hollow. Gone was the smirk, the swagger. He looked smaller, like the weight of exposure had shrunken him. Linda testified for the prosecution, her voice breaking, as she admitted her part. She cried on the stand, and though I wanted to feel anger, all I felt was a tired sadness. When I testified, the courtroom was silent. I told the truth plainly. How it found my name erased, how it'd been stalked, how it fought. I didn't add drama. The truth didn't need it. When I stepped down, I caught James staring at me. His eyes weren't angry anymore. They were empty, as if he finally understood that arrogance had carried him off a cliff. The verdict came after 3 days of deliberation. Guilty on fraud, guilty on conspiracy, guilty on intimidation. James was sentenced to 5 years. Linda, with her cooperation, got probation and community service. The cousins scattered like leaves in the wind, their reputations shredded. When the gavel struck, I didn't feel joy. I felt something heavier, something final. Revenge isn't fireworks. It's the silence after an explosion when the dust settles and you see what's left standing. And what was left was me. Charleston eventually moved on. New scandals replaced old ones. The reporters stopped calling. My shop picked up business again, partly from neighbors who wanted to support me, partly from folks who wanted to say they'd hired the man who beat his family in court. But I never forgot. One night, months after the trial, I returned to Magnolia Cemetery. I stood by Mom's grave again, the camellias blooming around me, the air thick with the scent of salt water and moss. I told her everything. How it fought, how it won, how the truth had survived. And when I left, I felt lighter. Not whole, not healed, but lighter. Then came the envelope, always the envelope. Slipped under my door one evening, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank except for one phrase scrawled in sharp black ink. We never forget. No signature, no threats, just those words. I stared at it for a long time, the silence of my house pressing in. Were they warning me, promising revenge of their own? Or was it just another way of reminding me that family wounds don't close, they scar? I pinned it to my corkboard alongside the others, sat back in my chair, and whispered into the empty room. Neither do I, and the truth hung there chilling and eternal. The winter after the trial was the quietest season of my life. Quiet, but not peaceful. The estate had finally been divided the way Mom wanted. The house on Trad Street went up for sale. The proceeds split evenly. The land in Goose Creek was parceled, the accounts balanced. On paper, fairness was restored. But no deed, no check, no court order could erase the fact that my family had tried to bury me alive. I walked past the Trad Street house one evening before it sold. The shutters were flaking, the old magnolia tree dropping its leaves on the bricks. Through the window, I could see the dining table where James had first slid that forged will across to me. The chandelier still had 2 bulbs burned out. I pressed my hand to the iron gate, remembering Mom's laughter. Annie's first visit, birthdays with sagging cakes. The house was full of ghosts, but none of them were mine anymore. I turned and walked away without looking back. Charleston is a city that remembers, though neighbors still stopped me on King Street, patting my shoulder. Strangers bought me coffee, saying they admired how I stood up for myself, but every kindness carried a shadow. I wasn't just John Dalton anymore. I was the man who fought his family. That title stuck harder than paint on my garage door. Carl told me not to mind it. Better to be remembered for standing up than forgotten for backing down, he said. But some nights sitting alone in my small house, I wondered if he was right. Winning had cost me blood, thicker than law, Linda never called. The cousins scattered ashamed or bitter, I couldn't tell James sat in a prison a few counties over. Sometimes I caught myself imagining him pacing, in a small cell still wearing that arrogant smirk in his mind, even if the world no longer saw it. One afternoon Elizabeth invited me for coffee. We sat outside a cafe on Broad Street. The winter sun slanting through the bare branches. She smiled warmly, but her eyes carried the weight of years of cases. You did more than win an inheritance, she said. You showed the court that even family can be held accountable. That matters. I nodded, sipping my coffee. It doesn't feel like victory. That's because it's not, she said simply. It's survival. Victory is too clean a word for something this messy. Her honesty settled over me like a blanket. Revenge, I realized, had given me justice, but not peace, and maybe peace was never part of the deal. Months passed. Life returned to routine. I fixed. Cabinets, repaired. Roofs, sanded decks. The rhythm of work steadied me, even as the silence of evenings pressed in. Then one night I heard footsteps outside. Again, slow, deliberate. I rose from my chair, heart pounding, and opened the door. No one stood there. Just another envelope on the mat. Inside, a photograph. My mother's grave at Magnolia Cemetery. Fresh flowers laid on it. Flowers I hadn't placed on the back. 2 words. Still here I sat with that photo for hours, staring at the handwriting, the slant of the letters. It wasn't James's. It wasn't Linda's. I didn't recognize it at all. And maybe that was worse. The next morning I pinned the photo to my corkboard with the others. The wall was full. Now spray-painted words, anonymous notes, photographs meant to scare me. But instead of fear, I felt something different. They were proof. Proof that no matter what they tried, I was still standing. Proof that erasing me had failed. I poured myself a bourbon that night, sat on the porch and listened to the cicadas hum against the Charleston. Dark, the city breathed around me alive, unbothered by the small wars of men. And I whispered the final truth to the night, to the ghost, to myself. You couldn't erase me then. You can't erase me now. And long after you're gone, I'll still be here. The wind carried the words away. But I knew they'd linger like scars, like memory, like revenge that never truly ends. The end.